The weight of the world. Samantha Reynolds gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white, her heart hammering in her chest. The pile of overdue bills on the table seemed to mock her, each envelope a reminder of how far she'd fallen. Her phone vibrated against the counter, lighting up with yet another notification. She didn't need to check. She already knew. It was another creditor demanding money she didn't have. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, running a hand through her unwashed hair. A weak voice called from the small bedroom down the hall. "Sam, are you home?" Samantha straightened, shoving the pile of bills into the drawer before heading toward her mother's room. Her mother, Karen Reynolds, lay in bed, her once vibrant face now pale and gaunt, her hair thinner than Samantha remembered. The sight sent a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. "You look exhausted, honey. Have you slept at all?" Karen's voice was soft, filled with concern, even in her condition. "I'm fine," Samantha lied, forcing a smile. "How's the pain today?" Karen tried to shift in bed but winced. Samantha immediately adjusted her mother's pillows and checked the IV line, her fingers moving automatically after months of routine. "Don't change the subject." Her mother reached for her hand, her grip weaker than it used to be. "The hospital called. They need coverage for tonight's shift." Samantha sighed. "The overtime pay is good, and Dr. Morrison says there's a new treatment we should consider." Karen squeezed her hand, shaking her head. "We can't afford more treatments, Sam. The house is already mortgaged. And your savings. Mom, please." Samantha forced a smile. "We have to try." Her phone buzzed again. Another debt collector. She quickly silenced the call before her mother could notice. "I have to take this shift," Samantha said, pulling away. "And I picked up extra waitressing hours at Lorenzo's." Karen's eyes filled with sadness. "You can't keep this up forever." "Watch me," Samantha said, forcing a grin. She grabbed her nursing scrubs from the chair. "I'll bring you dinner before heading to the hospital. Try to rest, okay?" She kissed her mother's forehead and walked out, but as soon as she stepped into the hallway, the weight of everything crashed down on her. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The medical bills were piling up faster than she could pay them. 3 jobs barely covered the interest on their debt, and the insurance company kept denying claims. She was running out of time. The car that ULDNT started. The engine sputtered as she turned the key. "Come on." Not now. Her old Honda had been on its last legs for months, but repairs were a luxury she couldn't afford. After 3 agonizing tries, the car finally roared to life. Samantha exhaled in relief and pulled out of the driveway. As she merged onto the highway, her stomach twisted. How much longer could she keep this up? How many more shifts? How many more loans? How many more sleepless nights before everything came crashing down? She pushed the fear down, gripping the wheel tighter. Survival was all that mattered. One shift at a time. One bill at a time. One breath at a time. The stranger in THE suet. Multiple trauma incoming. Dr. Morrison's voice echoed through the ER. Samantha rushed to the ambulance bay, tying her hair back. After 6 hours at Lorenzo's restaurant, she was running on coffee and sheer willpower. The paramedics burst through the doors, wheeling in a man with a deep leg wound. Behind them, a tall figure in an expensive suit followed, his face tense with concern. "What happened?" Samantha asked, helping to transfer the patient. "Construction site accident," the suited man answered. His voice was deep, controlled. "He works for my company." "Sir, you'll need to wait outside," Samantha said, but he didn't move. "I'm Ethan Sinclair," he said. "This is my responsibility." His eyes, sharp, gray, calculating, lingered on her for a second too long, as if recognizing something. Samantha frowned. Had they met before? "Let me at least make sure he's stable," Ethan added. Dr. Morrison nodded, and they got to work. But through the chaos, Samantha could feel Ethan watching her. Not in the way some men did, not in a predatory way. but with quiet intensity. The OFFER that CHANG is everything. 2 hours later, Samantha found Ethan in the waiting room, typing on his phone. "Mr. Reynolds is stable," she reported. "The surgery went well." Ethan stood, towering over her. "Thank you. Your dedication to your patients is impressive. Just doing my job." "No." He smiled slightly. "You're doing much more than that. I saw how you calmed him down. How you stayed past your shift to see it through." Samantha shifted uncomfortably. "Will that be all, Mr. Sinclair?" Ethan reached for his wallet. "Let me compensate you for the extra time." "That's not necessary. Please. I insist. I don't accept tips from patients' families." His eyebrows rose. "Principled. Rare quality these days." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. Another creditor. She silenced it quickly, but not before Ethan noticed. "Trouble." "Nothing I can't handle," she said, turning to leave. But she swayed slightly from exhaustion, and his hand shot out to steady her. "When was the last time you slept?" "I should check on Mr. Reynolds." "You're dead on your feet. Let me call you a car." "My shift's not over." Ethan studied her face. "You work at Lorenzo's too, don't you?" Samantha stiffened. "You're very observant, Mr. Sinclair. I make it my business to be." He pulled out a business card. "When you're ready to discuss a better opportunity, call me." Samantha stared at the card. "I'm not looking for—" "Yes, you are," Ethan interrupted. His voice was calm, certain. "You're drowning, Miss Reynolds. I'm offering a lifeline." Before she could argue, he walked away, leaving her standing there. The card felt heavy in her pocket. A lifeline. But at what cost? A deal with the devil. Samantha sat at the tiny kitchen table in her apartment, staring at the business card Ethan Sinclair had given her. The white card gleamed under the dim light, his name embossed in elegant, expensive font. Ethan Sinclair. Sinclair Enterprises. Private line. 212-555-0134. She traced the edge of the card with her finger, her thoughts spiraling. He was right. She was drowning. Her mother's treatment had drained every last cent. The house was hanging by a thread, mortgaged to the brink of foreclosure. Her car could die any day. And she was running on fumes. And yet, something about that man unsettled her. A lifeline. But lifelines always came with chains attached. Her phone vibrated again. She nearly jumped out of her chair, expecting another creditor. But it was Lorenzo's restaurant. She hesitated before answering. "Hello, Samantha. It's Tony." Her manager's gruff voice came through. "Listen, I hate to do this, but we gotta cut your hours." Her stomach twisted. "Wait, what? I'm barely making ends meet as it is." "Trust me, I know. But business is slow, and we can't afford to keep all our waitstaff full-time. You can still pick up shifts, but I can't promise consistency." Samantha squeezed her eyes shut. Of course. Another hit. Another piece of stability ripped away. "I understand," she whispered, even though she didn't. Even though she wanted to scream. She ended the call and exhaled shakily. The card felt heavier in her hand now. Lifeline or trap? She had no choice. She dialed the number. It rang once, twice. Then, "This is Sinclair." His voice was smooth, controlled. She could almost see his sharp gray eyes behind the phone, watching her, waiting. "This is Samantha Reynolds," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. A brief pause. Then, "I was wondering when you'd call." She swallowed. "Let's talk." The Proposition. They met in an upscale restaurant the next evening. Samantha had never stepped foot in a place like this before. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tablecloths, waiters in black suits. She felt like an imposter in her best dress, a simple navy blue number that suddenly seemed far too cheap for the occasion. Ethan was already seated when she arrived, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit. He stood when she approached, his eyes sweeping over her, assessing. "Miss Reynolds," he said smoothly, gesturing for her to sit. Samantha slid into the seat across from him, her heart hammering. The waiter appeared, pouring water into a crystal glass. Ethan barely acknowledged him. "Let's get to it," Samantha said. "You said you had an opportunity for me." A slight smirk touched his lips. "I like your directness." He leaned forward, fingers laced together. "I have a charity gala this weekend," he said. "I need a date." Samantha blinked. "A date?" "Yes." His expression remained unreadable. "Nothing more, nothing less. You accompany me, play the role of my partner for the evening, and in return." He slid an envelope across the table. She hesitated before picking it up. The envelope was thick, expensive. She opened it and nearly dropped it. $50,000. Cash. She looked up, stunned. "This is insane." "It's business," Ethan said simply. "You need money. I need someone who isn't after mine." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "So, what, you're paying me to be your escort?" His expression darkened. "Don't insult yourself. Or me." Heat crept up her neck. "You'll attend the gala with me. Act as my date. Smile for the cameras. And after the event, you walk away with the money. No strings." She exhaled sharply. "That's it. That's it." Her fingers tightened around the envelope. $50,000. That money could save her mother. It could buy time, get the treatments Karen desperately needed. It could pull them both back from the edge. And all she had to do was wear a dress and pretend to be someone she wasn't for a night. It felt too easy, too dangerous. Ethan studied her, as if reading her hesitation. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "Take the night. Think it over." She swallowed hard. "And if I say no?" His lips curved slightly. "Then I'll find someone else." Her stomach twisted at the thought. Because the truth was, she couldn't afford to say no. A deal sealed in silence. That night, Samantha sat beside her mother's hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Karen slept peacefully, the sound of her breathing soft and steady. Samantha held the envelope tightly, the weight of it pressing against her lap. Could she do this? Could she really go through with it? She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead. Then her phone buzzed. Another bill reminder. Another deadline she couldn't meet. Samantha took a deep breath. She pulled out Ethan's card and typed a message. "I'll do it." The response came seconds later. "I'll send the details in the morning. You won't regret this." But as she sat in the dimly lit hospital room, watching her mother sleep, she already did. And IGT to remember, Samantha stood in front of the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. A sleek black evening gown clung to her frame, its silky fabric whispering against her skin as she shifted. The diamond necklace resting against her collarbone felt heavy, foreign. Everything about this was wrong. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a nurse drowning in debt, not the type of woman who waltzed into grand ballrooms on the arm of a billionaire. And yet, here she was. Her phone vibrated. "Ethan Sinclair, your car will be outside in 5 minutes. Don't be late." Samantha exhaled sharply, pushing down the unease curling in her stomach. She had made her choice. Now, she had to live with it. The billionaire's world. The black Bentley pulled up to the curb of her tiny apartment complex. Samantha hesitated before stepping outside. The driver, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, opened the door without a word. She slid inside, the scent of leather and something distinctly expensive filling her lungs. Ethan sat across from her, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo. His sharp gray eyes scanned her, lingering for a fraction too long. "You clean up well," he said, his voice smooth, impassive. "Thanks." She folded her hands in her lap. "Your stylist picked the dress. And yet, you make it look better than it did on the mannequin." Samantha bit her lip, unsure how to respond to that. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as they drove toward the gala, a world she had no business stepping into. "You remember our story?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We met through mutual friends. I work in charity. You've been interested in me for months." "Good." He studied her for a moment longer before shifting his gaze outside. She exhaled slowly. She could do this. One night. Then she'd walk away with enough money to breathe again. A room full of securities. The venue was a palace disguised as a hotel. Samantha barely had time to absorb the breathtaking chandeliers, the grand marble staircase, the sea of elite socialites before Ethan placed a hand at the small of her back, guiding her forward. "Smile," he murmured. "You belong here tonight." The cameras flashed as they stepped into the grand ballroom. 100 eyes turned toward them. Samantha's pulse pounded, but she forced a serene expression onto her face, letting Ethan take the lead. They weaved through billionaires, politicians, power brokers, all whispering behind their champagne glasses. She could feel the weight of their curiosity. "Who's the new girl?" "She's beautiful." "Where did he find her?" Another temporary amusement. Samantha's spine stiffened. Ethan ignored them all, keeping his expression unreadable. But then, a woman in an emerald green gown stepped forward. Olivia Hastings. She was stunning, effortlessly poised, but there was a coldness to her beauty, an edge that made Samantha's skin prickle. "Ethan," Olivia greeted smoothly, eyes flickering toward Samantha. "And who's this?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Samantha Reynolds. My date." Olivia's lips curled. "Charming. You have a type." Samantha frowned. "A type?" Ethan shot Olivia a sharp look. "Don't start." Olivia just smirked. "Relax. I'm sure she'll do just fine, if she lasts longer than the others." With that, she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Samantha's stomach twisted. She turned to Ethan. What did she mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he offered her a champagne flute. "Let it go," he said. "Tonight isn't about them." But something about the way Olivia looked at her, like she knew something Samantha didn't, sent a chill down her spine. The man she wasn't supposed to meet. Samantha wandered to the balcony, escaping the suffocating crowd. She needed air. The city sprawled below, lights twinkling like fallen stars. "You don't belong here." She tensed at the voice. Turning, she found a man leaning against the railing, watching her. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his suit expensive, but subtly so. "Excuse me?" she asked. He tilted his head. "You don't belong in his world." She narrowed her eyes. "And you are?" "James Sinclair." He extended a hand. "Ethan's father." Her breath hitched. Ethan had never mentioned his father. Surprised, James chuckled. "He doesn't talk about me much. Can't say I blame him." Samantha hesitated before shaking his hand. "You're different from the others," James mused, studying her. "But you won't last." She bristled. "And why's that?" He took a sip of his drink. "Because I know my son," he said. "And I know how this ends." Her stomach twisted. "What exactly are you trying to say?" James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Walk away, Miss Reynolds," he said, "before you get caught in something you can't escape." Her fingers curled around the balcony railing. "What do you mean?" But before she could finish, Ethan appeared at her side. His expression was ice cold. "Father." His voice was dangerously calm. James smirked, amused. "Son." Ethan's grip on Samantha's waist heightened. "We're leaving." She barely had time to process before Ethan was leading her away from the balcony, away from his father's warning. "That was your father," she said breathlessly. "Forget him," Ethan said. Samantha pulled away. "No, I won't." What did he mean? What am I getting caught in? Ethan's jaw clenched. "Nothing you need to worry about." Samantha shook her head. I deserve to know. For the first time that night, something cracked in Ethan's expression. You deserve a lot of things, Samantha, he murmured. But the truth, it's not safe for you. Her pulse pounded. Not safe. Before she could demand more answers, a waiter approached. Mr. Sinclair, he said, you have a call. It's urgent. Ethan's expression darkened. He hesitated before turning to her. Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. Then he disappeared into the crowd. Samantha exhaled shakily. James Sinclair's words echoed in her mind. Walk away before you get caught in something you can't escape. She had taken the money, made the deal. But standing there, alone in the grand ballroom, she had the sinking feeling that she had just sold her soul to the devil. Shadows and securities. Samantha stood frozen in the middle of the grand ballroom, her fingers tightening around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. Ethan was gone. His father's words still lingered in her mind, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Walk away before you get caught in something you can't escape. Her stomach twisted. What was she caught in? Her deal with Ethan was supposed to be simple. One night. A transaction. A lifeline to keep her mother alive. But now, there were too many questions, too many warnings. And the strangest part, the way Ethan looked at her, like he wanted her close, but was afraid to let her in. Samantha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned, and her blood ran cold. Olivia Hastings was standing behind her, a glass of red wine in hand, watching her like a predator. Enjoying yourself? Olivia asked, voice smooth. Samantha straightened. I was. Olivia smirked. And yet, you look like a deer caught in headlights. Samantha swallowed. Why do you care? Olivia took a slow sip of her wine, eyes never leaving hers. You remind me of someone, she murmured. Samantha's skin prickled. Who? For the first time that evening, Olivia's mask slipped. And for just a second, just a flicker of time, there was something almost pained in her gaze. Then it was gone. Forget it, Olivia said, her usual confidence returning. You won't be around long enough for it to matter. Samantha narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Olivia smiled. And then she walked away. The call that changed EV or I thing. The gala stretched on, but Samantha couldn't focus. Her mind was spinning. The warnings, the cryptic looks, the weight of Ethan's name hanging over the room. It all felt wrong. And Ethan, he was still gone. Samantha turned, scanning the ballroom. Where had he gone? Her fingers itched to grab her phone and call him. But just as she took a step toward the exit, her phone vibrated. She exhaled in relief and checked the screen. But it wasn't Ethan. It was the hospital. Her heart nearly stopped. She rushed outside, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello, Samantha. The nurse's voice was urgent. It's about your mother. Samantha's blood turned to ice. What happened? She choked. She collapsed. Samantha felt the world tilt beneath her. She's stable for now, but the doctor says we need to move her to a higher-level facility. Her throat tightened. But I can't afford. That's why I'm calling. The nurse cut in. Someone already paid for it. Samantha's heart stopped. What? The full amount was wired to the hospital an hour ago. Anonymous donor. Her stomach clenched. No, not anonymous. There was only one person who could have done it. Ethan. The man who NEVER-LDF'd. Samantha stormed out of the ballroom, her heart racing. She didn't care about appearances. Didn't care about the flashing cameras or the whispers. All she cared about was finding him. She found Ethan outside, standing near the valet, talking on his phone. His back was to her, his broad frame rigid, his free hand clenched into a fist. She could hear the low murmur of his voice. Tense, controlled, dangerous. I don't care what it takes, he was saying. Just make sure it's handled. Samantha took a step forward. Ethan. He turned. The second he saw her, his expression shifted. His features softened, but his eyes remained sharp, as if calculating the situation. "I was just about to come find you," he said smoothly. "Are you all right?" She ignored his question. "You paid my mother's hospital bill." Ethan didn't even blink. "Yes." Samantha's chest tightened. "Why?" He exhaled. "Because you needed help." Her pulse pounded. "You had no right." "I had every right." He cut in. "Do you think I could stand by and watch you struggle when I could fix it with a single phone call?" Samantha's hands shook. "It wasn't your choice to make." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You wouldn't have accepted the money if I offered, and we both know it." She opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She would have refused, even if it meant losing her mother. Her eyes burned. Ethan's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "I don't expect anything in return, Samantha," he murmured. "I just—" He hesitated, his fingers flexing at his sides. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't lose her." Samantha inhaled shakily. Her anger faltered, just for a moment. Because despite everything, despite the secrets, the warnings, the danger, she believed him. But belief was dangerous, and so was he. She forced herself to step back. "I need to go to the hospital." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll take you. I can call a cab." "Samantha." She froze. His voice had dropped to something softer, something real. He held her gaze. "Let me take you." And even though she knew she shouldn't, even though she should have pushed him away, she nodded. The drive into darkness. The car ride was silent. The tension thick. Ethan's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. He hadn't said a word since they left the gala. Samantha watched him, studied the lines of his face, the way his muscles tensed, as if he was holding something back. She thought about Olivia's warning, about his father's words. "You don't belong in his world. Walk away before it's too late." And suddenly, she wasn't sure if she was sitting next to her savior or her undoing. The sleek black car cut through the city streets, its tires whispering against the pavement. Samantha sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her thoughts spiraling. Her mother was stable. That was all that mattered. But Ethan paid for it. A man she barely knew. A man wrapped in wealth, power, and secrets. The hospital had called it an anonymous donor, but she wasn't stupid. Ethan had bought her mother's life. And now she was sitting in his car, in his world, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into. Her voice broke the silence. "You had no right." Ethan didn't look at her. "You've said that already," he said calmly, keeping his eyes on the road. "And I'll keep saying it." She shot back. "You don't get to make decisions for me." "I didn't." His tone was measured, controlled. "I made a decision for your mother." Samantha's hands curled into fists. "And that's supposed to make it okay." Ethan exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the wheel. "I don't expect gratitude," he said after a moment. "I don't expect anything." She let out a bitter laugh. "Right, because rich men like you do things out of the goodness of your heart." His jaw tightened. "Believe what you want, Samantha. But the truth is simple." He turned, finally meeting her gaze. "You needed help," he said softly. "And I could help." Something in his expression, something raw, made her chest tighten. For a brief second, she forgot who he was, what he was. But then she remembered Olivia's words. "You remind me of someone." And James Sinclair's warning. "Walk away before it's too late." Samantha turned away, staring out the window as the city blurred past. "You don't get to control me," she whispered. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "I don't want to control you." She glanced at him, but his face was unreadable again. "You don't belong in my world, Samantha," he murmured. Her heart pounded. "Then why am I here?" Ethan didn't answer. And somehow, that terrified her more than anything. The hospital truth. When they reached the hospital, Samantha didn't wait for him to park. She pushed the door open before the car even fully stopped, rushing inside. Ethan cursed but followed. She ran down the sterile white hallways, ignoring the way the nurses glanced at her in surprise. "Where is she?" she demanded at the front desk. The nurse, recognizing her, softened. "Room 312. She's stable, but the doctor wants to speak with you." Samantha nodded and turned, only to nearly crash into Ethan. He caught her shoulders before she could stumble. His grip was firm. "Steady. Too steady. You don't have to follow me," she muttered. His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I know." And yet, he didn't move. Samantha swallowed hard and stepped past him, heading toward her mother's room. Karen's Arning. Karen Reynolds lay in bed, her skin pale against the white sheets. She looked up as Samantha entered, her lips curving into a weak smile. "Sammy," she breathed. Samantha rushed forward, grabbing her mother's frail hand. "Mom," she whispered, her throat tight. "I'm okay," Karen reassured her, though her voice was faint. "Just tired." Samantha forced a smile. "I thought I lost you," she admitted. Karen's hand squeezed hers. "Not yet." Samantha exhaled, forcing back the burn in her eyes. Then Karen's gaze flickered behind her. Her mother's expression changed. Samantha turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. Karen's grip on her hand tightened. Her mother's eyes, once soft, hardened. Samantha blinked in surprise. "You shouldn't be here," Karen said. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I had to make sure you were okay," he said simply. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Samantha looked between them. "You know him?" she asked slowly. Karen hesitated. Ethan was the one who answered. "No," he said. "We've never met." But Karen's gaze remained wary. And suddenly, Samantha knew he was lying. The letter she wasnt supigos d2c. That night, after the doctors had reassured her that her mother was stable, Samantha returned home. Her head was pounding. Nothing made sense. Her mother's reaction to Ethan. The secrets surrounding his name. And worst of all, her own instincts. Something was wrong. She needed answers. She walked into her mother's room, searching for something. Anything that would explain what Karen wasn't telling her. And that's when she saw it. A letter, peeking out from an old box of belongings. Samantha hesitated. Then, slowly, she pulled it out. The paper was yellowed. Age. She unfolded it, and the moment she saw the name written inside, her breath caught in her throat. Caroline Reynolds. Her mother's sister. Samantha's aunt. The letter was addressed to her mother. And the words inside made her blood run cold. "Dear Carrie-Ann, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. You need to protect Samantha. Don't let her get involved. Don't let him find her. Because if he does, she won't survive it. I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong man. And now I'm paying for it. Don't let history repeat itself. No matter what happens, keep her away from Ethan Sinclair. Caroline." Samantha's vision blurred. Her pulse pounded. The paper shook in her hands. Keep her away from Ethan Sinclair. Her mind reeled. Her aunt, a woman she had never met, warning her mother to keep her away from Ethan. She thought of her mother's reaction at the hospital, the way Karen had looked at Ethan like she had seen a ghost. And suddenly, Samantha knew. This wasn't just a deal. This wasn't just money. This was something deeper, something darker. And she was already in too deep. The eyes we bury. Samantha stood frozen in her mother's bedroom, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. Her pulse pounded against her skull, her breath shallow. The words on the page screamed at her, an echo from a past she hadn't even known existed. Keep her away from Ethan Sinclair. The weight of it settled like stone in her stomach. Caroline Reynolds. her mother's sister, a woman Samantha had never met, had never even heard of, writing from beyond the grave with a warning so clear, so urgent, that it made her skin crawl. And yet, here she was, wrapped in Ethan Sinclair's world, bound to him by debt, by desperation, by something she couldn't quite name. Samantha's hands curled around the paper. No, she wasn't going to let this sit. She was done with half-truths, done with secrets, done with the way Ethan and her mother and Olivia and everyone spoke in riddles, leaving her in the dark. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang. Once. Twice. Then. Samantha. His voice was smooth, steady. Too steady. She gritted her teeth. We need to talk. A pause. Where are you? She hesitated. Meet me at the old lighthouse, the one by the cliffs. Another pause. Then. I'll be there in an hour. The line went dead. Samantha exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on the letter. She didn't know what she was walking into. But one thing was certain. Ethan Sinclair had answers. And tonight, she was going to get them. The lighthouse truth. The lighthouse stood abandoned, looming over the jagged cliffs where the ocean crashed violently below. The wind howled around her as Samantha stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under her heels. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, the cold biting through her. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. And then, footsteps. Slow, measured. Ethan. He stepped into the dim light, dressed in all black, his sharp gray eyes locked on her. You don't pick the safest meeting places, he mused. Samantha didn't move, didn't blink. She held up the letter. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes, just for a second, flickered. You knew, she whispered. Ethan was silent. You knew my aunt. You knew about Caroline. And you never told me. His jaw clenched. I was going to. Don't. Samantha took a step closer, her voice shaking. You looked me in the eyes and told me you didn't know my mother, that you didn't know my family. His silence was deafening. She shoved the letter at him. Then why the hell did my aunt warn my mother to keep me away from you? Ethan took the letter slowly, his expression unreadable. His fingers traced the edges of the paper. Then, quietly, he said, because she was right. Samantha's breath caught. Ethan lifted his gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, his mask cracked. She was trying to protect you, he said. From me. The words sliced through her like ice. Her stomach turned. Why? Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then, he said the words that changed everything. Because Caroline Reynolds was the woman I was supposed to marry. A lovey that naive ways. The world tilted. Samantha's breath hitched. What? Ethan's gaze was sharp, guarded. Caroline and I were engaged, he said quietly. 2 years ago. Samantha staggered back, her mind reeling. That's impossible, she said. I never even knew she existed. Because she didn't want you to. Samantha's throat tightened. She wasn't supposed to exist in Ethan Sinclair's world. She wasn't supposed to know about her aunt. But here she was, caught in a storm of secrets, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Samantha forced herself to breathe. Then tell me, she said, her voice hoarse. Tell me what happened. Ethan exhaled, his fingers tightening around the letter. I loved her, he admitted, or at least I thought I did. But Caroline, she wasn't the person I thought she was. Samantha's stomach clenched. What do you mean? Ethan's expression darkened. She was hiding something. Something dangerous. Samantha swallowed. What was she hiding? Ethan looked at her then, his gaze heavy, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Evidence, he said. Against my father. Samantha's blood ran cold. Your father? Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. Caroline found proof that James Sinclair wasn't just a businessman, that he was involved in things. He hesitated. Illegal things. Samantha's fingers trembled. What kind of things? Ethan's eyes darkened. Money laundering, offshore accounts, criminal operations hidden under the guise of real estate investments. Samantha felt sick. And Caroline found out. She whispered. She did, Ethan said. And she was going to expose him. Samantha swallowed hard. And then she died. Ethan nodded. Her stomach lurched. You think your father had her killed? Ethan finished for her. I don't know. His voice was strained, raw. But I do know she called me that night. She said she needed to tell me something. That it was important. That she was in danger. Samantha's pulse raced. And you didn't go, she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes. No. The word hummed between them, thick with regret. Samantha's chest tightened. Caroline had tried to warn him. Tried to reach him. And now, 2 years later, she was dead. And Samantha was standing in her place. Her breath came faster. You said she was hiding something, she said. The evidence. Where is it? Ethan hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, We never found it. Samantha's mind whirled. If the evidence was still out there, then Caroline's fight wasn't over. And neither was the danger. She looked up at Ethan. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders tense. He had lost Caroline. And now he was trying to keep Samantha safe. But it was too late for that. Because she was already in too deep. Samantha inhaled sharply. Then, for the first time, she asked the question that had been burning inside her. Did you ever love her? Ethan's gaze flickered. Then softly. Yes, he admitted. Samantha's heart twisted. But he added, Not like I love you. The air between them shifted. Her pulse pounded. And suddenly, Samantha realized. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. And whether or not they would survive it. ALEJC of securities. The silence in the lighthouse was deafening. Samantha stared at Ethan, her heart hammering in her chest. Not like I love you. His words lingered in the cold air between them, wrapping around her like a vice. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that she was different. But how could she? When her entire life had been rewritten in a single night, when her mother had hidden the truth, when her aunt had died with secrets still buried. And now she was standing in the middle of a storm she didn't understand. Samantha clenched her fists. You keep saying you want to protect me, she said, but what if I don't want your protection? Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. This isn't a game, Samantha, he said. Then stop treating me like I'm too fragile to handle the truth, she snapped. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. You want the truth. Samantha nodded. Ethan took a step closer, his gray eyes storm dark. Then we find the evidence, he said, before my father does. Her breath caught. You mean? I mean if we don't, Ethan said, his voice low. You won't make it out of this alive. ALETTR, from TE past. Samantha and Ethan drove back to her mother's house, the roads empty under the weight of the night. Karen was asleep when they arrived, her breathing even but weak. Samantha hesitated, then reached for the letter again. There had to be something she missed. She read it once, twice. Then, on the third read, she saw it. A single sentence buried in the middle of the page. The truth is in the photographs, not the ones they know about. The ones hidden in plain sight. Samantha's pulse raced. The photographs, she murmured. Ethan looked up. What? She turned to him, excitement bubbling in her chest. My aunt was a photographer, she said. She always carried a camera. What if? She inhaled sharply. What if she hid the evidence in her photographs? Ethan's gaze darkened. If she did, he said, we need to find them. Samantha exhaled, her mind racing. There was only one place to look. Her studio, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Then let's go. The studio and Digaki shadows, AATFOLODED. Caroline's photography studio sat untouched, locked away in a forgotten part of the city. Dust coated the windows. The ghosts of the past lingered in the air. Ethan picked the lock effortlessly, and they stepped inside. Samantha inhaled sharply. Photographs hung on the walls. Black and white cityscapes, candid moments, a world frozen in time. But it wasn't the images that made her stomach churn. It was the sense that someone had been here before them. Ethan moved ahead of her, scanning the space. If your aunt hid something, he said, where would it be? Samantha turned, eyes sweeping the room. Then she saw it. A shelf filled with old film canisters. Her breath caught. She rushed forward, fingers brushing over the labels. Each one was marked with a date. Then she saw it. The night Caroline died. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. But before she could grab it, a gunshot rang through the air. The window behind them shattered. Samantha screamed as Ethan grabbed her, pulling her to the floor. More shots. Glass rained down around them. Move, Ethan shouted, dragging her toward the back exit. Her heart raced. She barely had time to process the fact that someone had just tried to kill them. They burst into the alley behind the studio, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. A black SUV screeched down the street. Samantha's breath caught. Ethan pulled a gun from his waistband and fired 3 shots. The SUV swerved but kept going, disappearing into the city. Ethan turned to her, his expression grim. They knew we'd come here. Samantha's stomach twisted. Who? Ethan's jaw clenched. My father. The FINALPC of DGTPVZ. They didn't stop driving until they reached Ethan's penthouse, an impenetrable fortress of steel and glass high above the city. Samantha sat at the massive dining table, her hands still shaking. The film canister sat in front of them, the only thing they had left. Ethan grabbed an old film projector, setting it up in front of the wall. Samantha exhaled sharply. This was it, the moment of truth. Ethan loaded the film. The projector whirred to life, and the images began to play. The first frames were nothing unusual. A gala. Men in suits, women in gowns. Then, a man shaking hands with James Sinclair. Ethan tensed beside her. That's Senator Caldwell, he muttered, my father's biggest political connection. The frames kept shifting. More men, more handshakes. And then, a photo of Caroline, standing alone. Her face was blurred, but her fear was clear. Samantha's chest tightened. Then the final image appeared, and her breath caught. A black car, the same black SUV that had just tried to kill them. And standing next to it, a man in a suit, holding a gun. Samantha gasped. That's... Ethan stiffened, his hands clenched into fists. That's my father's right-hand man, he said, his voice like ice. Samantha's skin prickled. She could barely breathe. Caroline didn't die in an accident, she whispered. Ethan exhaled sharply. No, he said. She was murdered. The illest est. The truth crashed into Samantha like a tidal wave. Caroline had found something she wasn't supposed to, and James Sinclair had her killed for it. And now, if they weren't careful, they would be next. Samantha's hands shook, but her eyes burned with determination. What do we do? She asked. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers. We finish what Caroline started, he said. We expose them. Samantha nodded. Her fear melted away, replaced by resolve. Because this wasn't just about her aunt anymore. This wasn't just about the past. This was about justice, about making sure no one else had to suffer. Ethan reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. You ready for this? Samantha met his gaze. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into his world. She wasn't drowning anymore. She was fighting. She squeezed his hand. Yes, she said. Let's end this. The beginning of the end. The battle wasn't over. But they had the truth now. And the truth had power. They just had to survive long enough to use it. And with Ethan by her side, Samantha was ready to fight. Because some secrets were worth dying for. But some truths were worth living for.